Hey guys, Mrs. Palmer here. We are going to finish the last section of chapter 14. This is on the 14th century in Europe, I guess coincidentally, maybe not. And it's called the Time of Troubles because a lot of very bad things and very difficult things were going on, especially during the 14th and 15th centuries. There was a lot of violence. There was a great deal of social upheaval. Before we get into things really specifically, it's helpful to look at some background information first. So, what things were going on in the 14th century in Europe that created all this upheaval? Well, one of those things was a schism in the church, another division. This was not the Eastern Great Schism that we talked about before, where the one church split into East and West. This was actually a schism or a split just within the Western Church. We'll talk about that very soon. The Black Plague happened during this time period, and war as well, the Hundred Years' War, which you already read about. So the first thing we're going to look at is the Great Western Schism, and I like to put Western in parentheses just to differentiate it or distinguish it from the Eastern Schism. So in this split or division in the Western Church, Philip IV of France had a face-off with Pope Boniface VIII. Okay, guys, so one of the things we're going to talk about is what was called the Great Western Schism. It often is referred to as just the Great Schism, but eighth. So what happened here was Philip IV of France faced off with Pope Boniface VIII. This happens in around 1300, and what in 1303, Philip kidnaps the Pope, but he ends up releasing him, but the Pope was pretty old, and so he dies pretty quickly after he's released. And then in 1305, Philip gets the cardinals to choose a French archbishop as Pope, and his name is Clement V. Does that creates all this drama is he moves the headquarters of the papacy from Rome to Avignon, France, which is where it ends up being for the next 69 years. And this weakens the church for a number of reasons. The 11th. So a lot of people are unhappy about this because, of course, the papacy has always been in Rome, and that's where St. Peter was, and it was just very untraditional and felt a bit crazy to most Catholics at the time. Well, Pope Gregory the 11th dies in 1378, and so the cardinals meet as they do in Rome to choose a successor, and many want an Italian pope, and so they get it. They get an Italian pope who ends up becoming Pope Urban VI. Well, Urban clashes with the cardinals. He does not get along with them. He has a strong personality, so they end up deciding, okay, we don't want to deal with Pope Urban, so we're going to elect a second pope. So that's what they do. They elect a second pope a few months later, and this is a French-speaking pope who is chosen, named Clement VII. Now, what's the problem? We've got two popes, and so they don't get along either, and they're both arguing over who's the real pope. Will the real pope please stand up, please stand up, please stand up? And so they excommunicate each other. And the French pope lived in Avignon while the Italian pope lived in Rome. And this then begins this big church split or division known as the Great Schism of the West. They get very frustrated and they end up excommunicating each other, but they both refuse to step down. They both refuse to resign as pope. So the French pope continues to live in Avignon, France, while the Italian pope continues to live in Rome, and this then begins what we call the Great Western Schism. The Council of Constance in 1414 is the council that finally meets to end the Great Schism by choosing a single pope. So by now there are a total of 3 popes. The Avignon Pope, the Roman Pope, and now a 3rd Pope elected by an earlier council at Pisa. But with the help of the Holy Roman Emperor, the council forces all 3 popes to resign, and then in 1470, and a new pope is chosen. And in 1417, the council chooses a new pope, and this new pope is Pope Martin V, but it does a lot of damage. Weakens the papacy, it discredits. So the Great Schism ends, but it's not a good thing for the papacy. Meanwhile, at this time, a number of things are challenging the traditional Catholic Church in Europe. Meanwhile, a number of scholars begin challenging church authority from within. A man named John Wycliffe, who lived in England, and he basically argued that the Bible is the only authority for the Christian life, that you shouldn't listen to the Pope or any of the things that the church asks you to do if it's not in the Bible. He also argued that Jesus is the only true head of the church, not the Pope. He reprimanded the very secular attitude of the church, or what he felt to be a secular attitude. He said the clergy should not be able to own land or wealth. It was a distraction and it made them greedy, that clergy should renounce all things and just live faithfully, pouring out their lives to and for the church. He also argued that we needed an English translation of the Bible, and so he helped to inspire an English translation of the New Testament of the Bible. And so he was just one of a number of people. Another one was a man named Jan Hus. Jan is just the German name for John. And he was also influenced by Wycliffe. He actually was a professor in a place called Bohemia, which is now the Czech Republic, the area that's the Czech Republic. And he had the same basic ideas as Wycliffe, basically that the authority of the Bible should come first, that anything that the Pope says should fall in line with Scripture, and the Scripture should be over the word of the Pope. And he was eventually excommunicated. In the 1300s, an epidemic strikes, or a pandemic strikes parts of Asia, North Africa, and Europe, and ultimately about 1/3 of the population of Europe dies from this deadly disease. Unlike catastrophes that pull communities together, this epidemic was so terrifying that it completely ripped apart every fabric of society. And Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer of the time, described its. Boccaccio, one of the writers of the time period, Giovanni Boccaccio, an Italian writer of the time, described its effect when he said, "This scourge had implanted so great a terror in the hearts of men and women that brothers abandoned brothers, uncles their nephews, sisters their brothers, and in many cases wives deserted their husbands. But even worse, fathers and mothers refused to nurse and assist their own children." And this comes out of Boccaccio's most famous work called the Decameron, which talks about the impact of the plague. The plague started in Asia, as we mentioned, and it came through trade routes, infecting, like I said, parts of Asia, the Muslim world, and Europe. And in 1347, a fleet of Genoese merchant ships arrived in Sicily carrying the bubonic plague. It got the name because of the purplish or blackish spots that it produced on the skin. And this disease sweeps through Italy, and from there it follows trade routes to Spain, France, Germany, England, and other parts of Europe and North Africa. But it took about 4 years to reach almost every corner of Europe. Some communities were able to escape relatively unharmed, but in others, about 2/3 or up to 2/3 to 3/4 of the population of those who caught it died. Before the bubonic plague ran its course, it killed almost 25 million Europeans and many more millions in Asia and North Africa. And then it would come back every few years, though it never struck as severely as it did in the first outbreak. Anything sound a little familiar, a little scary right now talking about the Black Plague with COVID-19, but I digress. So the plague was spread by rats who were infested with fleas that carried the bacterial infection, and it was brought through trade. And so as Europe started to emerge from sort of this old feudalistic order of seclusion, and they started to trade with Muslims and with Asians, everything began to spread very quickly. Not only goods, but also diseases. And one of the biggest ones was a huge economic effect. For one thing, the old system of feudalism, the old manorial system began to crumble. And some of the changes that occurred were also a huge decrease in population because, of course, all these people were a decline in trade and prices rose. So while trade declined, prices went up. There were also some major social changes. A lot of peasants were unhappy. They couldn't get enough to eat. Things were bad. And so they began revolting, wanting, or, sort of demanding higher wages. And this kind of spread across Europe from England to France to Italy and Belgium, a lot of peasants. Another major social effect was anti-Semitism, which is persecution of the Jews. Jews were falsely blamed for bringing on the plague. It was believed they poisoned the wells to try to kill off the Christian children, all kinds of bizarre theories around that. And so a lot of Jews were driven from their homes, or even worse, they were massacred during this time period. Families were torn apart. As I said, there were a lot of people who, like mothers who abandoned their infants, stopped nursing them, just left them to die. Husbands and wives left each other. Mothers left children. Children left their aged parents. So a lot of families were torn apart during this time. There was also another interesting effect, religious fanaticism. So remember in the Monty Python video, we saw the monks singing and walking with, like, banging their heads with boards. These guys are called flagellants. That was, of course, just a parody making fun of this, but there were a number of very religious people, especially monks, who would do some sort of physical harm to their body, hoping to purge themselves of their sin. So some people became more religiously fanatic, other people just stopped believing altogether, and some people started thinking, well, maybe there's no God, nobody's answering my prayers. Some priests abandoned their flocks. And so you had various reactions to what was actually happening. The third major event of the terrible 14th century I want to talk about was the 100 Years' War, which you already read about, I hope. It lasted over 100 years, actually about 116 years, and it began in 1337. Essentially, England and France were fighting over land, who had the right to rule over territories such as Gascony and Flanders. So when the last Capetian king died without a successor, England's Edward III, as the grandson of Philip IV, claimed the right to the French throne. the war that Edward III launched for the throne continued on and off from 1337 to 1453, and so it became known as the Hundred Years' War. Victory passed back and forth between the two countries, and then finally between 1421 and 1453, the French rallied and drove the English out of France entirely except for the port of Calais. And the Hundred Years' War brought a lot of major changes to Europe. So there are a number of battles that you should at least be familiar with that occurred during the Hundred Years' War. A couple of those are the Battle of Crécy and the Battle of Poitiers, both which the English won in spite of, or despite being outnumbered by the French, which was, the French army was actually 3 times the size of the English army, and the French army included knights and archers with crossbows. French knights thought they were invincible and attacked, and the English longbowmen let thousands of arrows fly to the oncoming French. The crossbowmen, peppered with English arrows, retreated in panic, and the knights trampled their own archers in an effort to cut a path through them. But the English longbowmen sent volley after volley of deadly arrows, and unhorsed knights who then lay helplessly on the ground in their heavy armor. Then, using their long knives, the English foot soldiers attacked and essentially slaughtered the French. At the end of the day, more than a third of the French forces lay dead, among them some of the most honored knights in chivalry. So in the end, it was the longbow, not chivalry, that had won the day. And so at this point, that's another big change that occurs during the Hundred Years' War, is this old school mounted, heavily armored medieval knight was becoming extinct. The English also repeated their victory 10 years later at the Battle of Poitiers, and their third major win was the Battle of Agincourt in 1415, led by Henry V, victorious. And of course, you guys have all heard of Joan of Arc, who leads the French to victory at Orleans under King Charles VII, and we'll talk about her in a few minutes. I'm going to play a scene from this movie for you, Henry V and the Battle of Agincourt. This is taken from Shakespeare's famous play, Henry V. It was made into a movie, I think in either the late 80s or the early 90s, and it was a very good movie, and so I'm going to play you this speech.
Now, my fair cousin, if we are marked to die, we are enough to do our country loss. And if to live, the fewer men, the greater share of honor. God's will, I pray thee, wish not one man more. Brother, proclaim it, Westmoreland, through my host, that he which hath no stomach to this fight, let him depart. His passport shall be made, and crowns for convoy put into his purse. We would not die in that man's company that fears his fellowship to die with us. This day is called the Feast of Crispian. He that outlives this day and comes safe home will stand at tiptoe when this day is named, and rouse him at the name of Crispian. He that shall see this day and live old age will yearly, on the vigil, feast his neighbours and say, tomorrow is St. Crispin's. Then will he strip his sleeve and show his scars and say, these wounds I had on Crispin's day. Old men forget, yet all shall be forgot, but he'll remember with advantages what feats he did that day. Then shall our names, familiar in their mouths as household words, Harry the King, Bedford and Exeter, Warwick and Talbot, Salisbury and Gloucester, be in their flowing cups freshly remembered. This story shall the good man teach his son, and Crispian shall ne'er go by from this day to the ending of the world. But we in it shall be remembered. We few, we happy few, we band of brothers. For he today that sheds his blood with me shall be my brother. Be he ne'er so vile, this day shall gentle his condition. And gentlemen in England now abed shall think themselves accursed they were not here, and hold their manhoods cheap, while any speaks that fought with us upon St. Crispin's day. My sovereign lord, bestow yourself with speed. The French are bravely in their battle set, and will with all expedients march upon us. All things are ready if our minds be so.
Punish the man whose mind is backward now.
Thou dost not wish more help from England, coz?
God's will, my liege. Would you and I alone, without more help, can fight this royal battle?
You know your places. God be with you all.
Once more I come to know thee, King Harry, if for thy ransom thou wilt now compound before thy most assured overthrow.
Who hath sent thee now?
The Constable of France.
I pray thee bear my former answer back. Bid them achieve me, and then sell my bones. God! Why should they mock poor fellows thus? Let me speak proudly. Tell the constable, we are but warriors for the working day. Our gayness and our guilt are all besmirched with rainy marching in the painful field. But by the mass, our hearts are in the trim. Herald, save thou thy labour. Come thou no more for ransom, gentle herald. They shall have none, I swear, but these my joints, which, if they have, as I shall leave them, shall yield them little. Tell the constable.
I shall, King Harry. And so fare thee well. Thou never shalt hear Harold any more.
My lord, most humbly on my knee, I beg the leading of the varmint. Take it. Brave York. Now, soldiers, march away, and how thou pleasest God, dispose the day.
So the backdrop behind the story of Joan of Arc that most of us are familiar with, the backdrop is that the French and English were, fighting each other for almost 100 or more than 100 years. And after the Battle of Agincourt, which we just saw in that video clip, Henry V forced the French to sign a treaty that he was going to inherit the French crown after the current French king, that is Charles VI, died. Then in 1429, a teenage French peasant girl named Joan of Arc, or Joan who was from a place called Arc, felt moved by God to help rescue France. So she believed God was speaking to her. She heard voices of what she believed to be saints. She saw visions, and she believed that they were calling her to drive the English away from France and to give the French crown back to, or to make sure that Prince Charles would be the one to inherit the crown. And so she ultimately convinces Prince Charles to allow her to lead the army into Orleans, and ultimately they experience a victory. So Prince Charles ultimately got crowned king. He became Charles VII. And later, some allies of the English, the Burgundians, captured Joan in battle and they turned her over to the English. And then the English in turn turned her over to the church, and the church condemned her as a heretic. So she was tried by the English church for witchcraft and heresy and burned at the stake in 1431 at the age of 19 years old. Unfortunately, King Charles did nothing to help her. So the impact of the Hundred Years' War on Europe was very extensive. It was a long and exhausting war for both sides. It finally ended in 1453, and it had it caused significant changes in society for both the English and the French. One of the most important things, and by the way, it was harder on the French, mainly because the English had the sort of machine gun of the Middle Ages called the longbow that we mentioned. One of the most important takeaways from the Hundred Years' War is that England and France both started developing a strong feeling of nationalism. So this feeling of nationalism began to emerge in both England and France. And now people thought of the king as a national leader fighting for the glory of the country, not simply as a feudal lord. So in the Middle Ages, of course, where was your loyalty? It was to your local lord, whoever you had a contract with, right? A feudal contract with. This is different. Now you're fighting for England. And so some historians consider the end of the Hundred Years' War in 1453 as the end of the Middle Ages. The twin pillars of the medieval world, religious devotion and the code of chivalry, both crumbled at this point. The Age of Faith also arguably died a slow and painful death. This was in part due to the Great Schism that we talked about, the Western Schism, as well as the scandalous display of wealth by the church and the discrediting of the church during the bubonic plague, when people either went crazy religious in a weird way or they completely abandoned faith. The age of chivalry died on the battlefields of Crécy, Poitiers, and Agincourt. But with the Hundred Years' War, talking about the longbow, there were significant changes to technology during the Hundred Years' War. And another important thing that happened was the English Parliament developed significantly. So it went from just being more of a kind of a symbolic entity to actually beginning to make more of a difference in having a voice in government. So again, this was the end of medieval society.